The caucus is over. Now on to the general election. We're exploring what comes next. That's today on Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstat, Cashman Equipment, and additional supporting sponsors.
After issues in Iowa, the nation had its eyes on Nevada's caucus. Despite early worries about the use of the new tool, the process was relatively smooth. Over 75,000 people voted early, followed by 25,000 Nevadans who voted on caucus day. Although the results took several days to roll in, Bernie Sanders was declared the winner with 46% of the vote, defeating the next candidate by nearly 30 points. Joe Biden came in second, followed by Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren. Now that the caucus is over, Nevadans have their sights set on the 2020 election. To reflect on the caucus process plus explore what we can expect the next 10 months, we are joined by Robert List, former Nevada governor, Robert Lang, executive director at the Lindsay Institute, Megan Jones, partner at Hilltop Public Solutions, and Ed Commenda, reporter at the Reno Gazette-Journal and USA Today Network. Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And Megan, I want to start with you. As we mentioned in our intro here, Senator Bernie Sanders won by a margin that maybe few expected. They won across many different demographics, many of the major demographics. I'm wondering, what are some of your impressions of the caucus now that it's over?
Well, I think the caucus was successful. I think that voters definitely made their choice known, and I was surprised by the margin of victory. However, I think when you saw the early vote numbers come in every night, it was clear that caucus goers who were first-time caucus goers were making up a majority of those early votes, and those skewed heavily towards Senator Sanders. So I think those were reflected in the overall outcome.
Ed, you're out there, you're doing reporting. Let's talk about maybe after the caucus. What are people saying? What are their reactions?
There's a couple things that I've been looking at, and one of them is the effect of the union's messaging on rank and file workers, because in the lead up to the caucus, there was a lot of talk about Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan and how that could end culinary health care, which is something that they have fought so hard to maintain. Yet, when you go to a place like Precinct Bellagio, which is the most valuable precinct on the Strip, it's worth 51 delegates at the county convention. When that room split for that alignment, it was clear that there really wasn't much of a trickle down. The union had this messaging about ending healthcare, yet there were still a lot of Bernie signs in that room. And as we saw with the results, he still won.
Yeah,
so
Robert,
that was interesting.
Robert, can you speak to that a little bit? Culinary Union opposed Bernie Sanders, and yet we have a lot of the membership that clearly is voting. If I'm not mistaken, 5 out of the 7 precincts on the Strip went to Sanders. What is that saying about the difference between leadership and maybe membership of Culinary Union?
Very different than 16, where Clinton had the support of the Strip, and that was the difference in the state. They didn't endorse anyone. So if you don't endorse a single candidate, you are kind of saying to the union, it's a signal, vote as you will. Then they kind of semi-unendorsed Biden over the controversy involving, culinary's so-called Cadillac benefits, and would they go away? And, Sanders, of course, countered that. That wasn't true. And another point I'd like to raise about Sanders, what's interesting, and this is the quirk of the primaries. So if you look at the first alignment vote, Sanders is actually at 34%. And then we were given rank order voting. So we were given up to 5 choices. Of course, you had to do 3 or it spoiled your ballot.
For the pre-vote, you're talking
about. For the pre-vote. So
Correct.
if you voted in the Saturday to Tuesday window, when you were given the pre-vote, you were given the rank order choices, and it was a proxy for you to attend, an actual caucus. Your vote moved around the room instead of you. Sanders must have been a lot of number 2 votes because he went into that second round, gained 40% right there, and then the 46+% is the actual caucus vote. So the geography he won was wide. So it was wide in not just sort of demographic scope, but in geographic terms, he picked up all sorts of parts of the state, and a lot of really rural and conservative areas where you might imagine that a moderate Democrat might live. It's not true. If you're a Democrat in Ely and places like that, you might want Sanders as well. You might be in the left-leaning part of the party.
Interesting. Governor List, let's talk more about that moderate conservative vote then. Some of your impressions there. If some of the early polls are correct, it looks like that Sanders was very competitive against Biden and Buttigieg for that moderate conservative Democratic vote.
He was. I think it all turns to the question of who are the people who showed up and voted, either early or at the caucuses themselves. My suspicion is, and I haven't seen the demographics of it, is that it's a much younger cross-section of the voting public. It's been my personal experience, at least in history, that the older a person becomes, the less likely they are to vote for the folks on the far left. And that's certainly true in rural Nevada. And I was surprised by Sanders' strength in rural Nevada, and by Buttigieg's strength, and by, frankly, the lack of power that Klobuchar showed and that Biden showed, relatively. So I'm not sure it's a good indicator of what November will look like, because it was a one-shot kind of sample of who cared enough to turn out for a caucus run by a party rather than a state-conducted election.
Right. And we're going to get to the conversation about primary and caucus in just a second, too. Megan, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the campaign strategies that Sanders employed that maybe really led to maybe especially some of the specific Hispanic vote and the black vote that we saw that went in Sanders' favor more so than maybe would have expected as well.
Sure. I mean, a caucus, to Dr. Lang's point and Governor List's point, caucuses are different than primaries. Caucuses really are about grassroots organizing, and Senator Sanders had a leg up from day one because of his strength here in 2016. I think he did better here than most expected in 2016, and all he needed to do relative to the other candidates on the election stage still was refire that campaign. And it's clear that he had a massive imprint in Nevada and did not take it for granted. Whereas I think other campaigns had to make strategic decisions based on resources. He was able to fundraise and hire early, and that paid off. Whereas I think with Klobuchar, for instance, I think she had less than a week to hire 100 people to come in and try to vault her from a third position in New Hampshire to relative unknownness to most of the folks who would be voting in a caucus. So I think Sanders, it's clear that Sanders, I think John Ralston's hashtag of We Matter, he took it literally, and the rest of the campaigns were playing catch up from day one.
And Robert, it's a great point. And if we talk about how long this campaign stretch has happened on the Sanders side, maybe we look all the way back to 2016 here. He did campaign early. He had staff members on the ground, and he's got a lot of finance money too. Is that the factor here?
Yeah, and he also, speaking specifically to the outreach to the Latino community, he practiced what his campaign refers to as culturally competent outreach, which is that they don't show up in a Latino community with a mariachi band and eating tamales. It's not condescending. He spoke right to the issues that matter: minimum wage, quality of K through 12 education, health care. And he spoke in those communities. He didn't attempt to speak Spanish. He spoke as Bernie and came off as authentic and authentically, concerned with that community. And he had this success in 16 as well. Again, he won just by a hair the Latino vote in 16, much to the surprise of many observers, because at that point he had trouble breaking through with minority voters. That's the image of the Bernie bro, is of a white, male, privileged Vermont J. Crew catalog, sort of looking fella. It's totally false. It's mostly women, younger, women of color. He reached into that community. He organized that community. He spoke directly to their concerns. He did not condescend. Some of the charges with Buttigieg were he had a problem bridging that divide. He had a problem relating to the Southwest Latino community. And I'll just end on this note. This is the same community. We're a microcosm of the next two big states that vote. The two biggest states in the union are California and Texas. They have about 40% Latino. That is why you saw Sanders celebrate the win in San Antonio, the biggest metro with the largest Latino share in the United States, because he's playing exactly to that same demographic on Super Tuesday.
And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that strategy. It sounds like you know what the strategy is going to be right there. I want to talk a little bit about the Republican side here, Governor List. We're talking a lot about the Democratic caucus, but there was a lot of activity on the Republican side. First off, we saw Trump campaign here for multiple days, both doing campaign stops regionally, but also here in Las Vegas. But also on Democratic Caucus Day was the Nevada GOP, where they formally pledged all delegates to President Trump. First off, Governor List, what are the benefits, or maybe what are some of the risks of opting not to have a caucus here in our state?
Well, I think the decision was made on the fact that most people are not going to turn out when there's not a real serious contest. And I know you intend to talk a little bit about primaries before we're done here. I think the party apparatus would not have been able to turn people out for a easily foreseen result.
Now, the Nevada Dems, statistics are correct, 10,000 new Democrats registered. Right. Is that a drawback then of not having a caucus, of not having that engagement, or is the Republican Party seeing that we're also seeing an increase in registrations?
Well, we're not seeing the increase in this county that the Democrats have seen so far. My expectation is the party's going to ramp up registration drives, and it's about time they did, frankly. The spread has increased dramatically, as we all know. But I see a huge amount of support for Donald Trump. I spent some time with him last week. I also attended the rally, and I look at that crowd. There are thousands of people, and my guess is that the majority of them were Democrats or independents. It was a cross section of our community. It was Latinos. It was African Americans, and it was lots of young people, enormous amounts of young people. He really has a driving strength and power, and it brings them in. It brings them in, and they weren't just there to look. They were enthusiastic. It was a rowdy, big crowd that loved what they were hearing.
And do you think the drive more for registration is going to happen maybe after the conventions? Is that when we're really going to see kind of that push from the Republican Party?
I think so. And of course, with the new law, they can register on Election Day. Yeah. So I think we're going to see a big turnout from Republicans.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the caucus. We had the opportunity to go and visit both the pre-caucus, pre-vote, and also the caucus on Caucus Day and talk to some voters. Let's take a look at that. At UNLV, students and visiting locals waited up to 2 hours to vote early. Although lines were long, those waiting felt the wait was worth it.
Honestly, the 1 hour and 30 wait isn't that bad at all.
Like many people caucusing this year, John Seaton is a first-time voter. We talked to him before and after casting his preference. He was a bit confused while waiting in line, but afterwards said the process was simple.
It was pretty fast once I got in there. I think being able to vote is one of your greatest rights as an American.
Caucus Day was a similar story. We visited Sierra Vista High School, where caucus goers were met with long, confusing lines. However, once checked in, the process seemed to simplify.
I have to say this is not my first caucus. I did the Nevada caucuses in 2016, and it seems to be going much better this time than it did in 2016.
Neighbors wearing buttons and shirts for their candidates proudly voiced their opinions.
I caucused for Warren.
We came to caucus for Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden.
Regardless of who their first choice was, many Democrats agreed they'll support the final nominee in November.
I'm here because I'm passionate about not having President Trump in the office any longer. My bumper sticker literally says, anyone but Trump in 2020. So whoever the Democratic person is at the final, I will be voting for them.
We spent the day with Precinct 6725. 27 people showed up in person. An additional 67 voted early.
I'll count these up.
Although there was some confusion about the caucus math, this precinct ended the process after about 2 hours. Bernie Sanders earned 9 delegates. Pete Buttigieg won 4. Fred Como caucused for Buttigieg. This was his first caucus, and he hopes it's his last.
Make it a primary. It's difficult. There were some individuals here who are unhappy with the process and thinking that their vote today, quote unquote vote today, did not count.
So we'll get to Fred's comments there in a second, but Ed, I want to start with you. You were out there, as you already mentioned. Process-wise, what were some of the good, what were some of the bad that you saw out there?
Well, the good of a caucus, I think, is that at the end of the day, it's a discussion about candidates. So someone who may not be boned up on what the candidates have to offer in this country can go to a caucus and hear representatives speak about what candidates have to offer. The bad, again, I have to focus on the union workers at the Bellagio. A lot of them are terribly shy to speak to reporters about who they support. I think there's a big reason why only 121 people showed up to the most valuable precinct on the Strip. There's no secret ballot, so when you're carrying a sign, people know who you vote for. And when it comes to union workers, the status quo of maintaining their lifestyle and the way people look at them and the benefits they have, they're not going to let politics get in the way of that. So the secret ballot part was a point of contention for a lot of voters. A lot of voters aren't that opinionated as well. I mean, when you have multiple choices to make on a ballot, that could be a little bit jarring for the average voter. Some of the voters I talked to said that this election is way too important to give people, multiple choices. Have a regular primary, allow them to keep their ballot secret, and then the early voting numbers that clearly appealed to the voters. I mean, 75,000 showed up. Most of them didn't carry signs. A lot of them did, but a lot of them kept their votes private.
Yeah.
Early voting's a religion in Nevada. I mean, over time, we've seen the share of people who vote early rise every election. I think it's close to 65%, and this was no different. I think caucuses have run their course. I do think they're a powerful organizing tool for state parties, which is why the state party here kept it for as long as we did, and also because the DNC required that we had a caucus instead of a primary. Because of these strange rules that are created on the East Coast, and I think we have to have a larger discussion about it. With all due respect to the governor, though, I do think that by the time the Republicans decide to start registering voters, it may be too little too late. AVR, automatic voter registration, which was passed in the legislature with a Democratic governor for the first time in 20 years, has changed fundamentally the game. And if the Republicans don't spend money quickly, I think that margin will pass them by.
I would just say this, that you're going to see a lot of crossover voting. You're going to see a lot of Democrat votes for Trump, and you're going to see a lot of independents, I think, are going to swing heavily toward Trump. You're absolutely right. What's happened from a registration point has been very, very concerning to me. But I also think that the basic philosophy of Nevadans generally is still creative and open to ideas and lots of Western independence, and we're going to see a lot of crossover.
And to move the caucus into the third spot. So when we were given that opportunity, so Harry Reid becomes majority leader in the 06 win, and he has tremendous influence. And we've had a caucus since 1972, I believe. So we've had a caucus for a lot of years. But it was softer to put a caucus between the primary in New Hampshire and the primary in South Carolina. So we maintained the caucus in part because we were required to by the party back in the East. So now, of course, famously, Harry Reid has come out and said, that's the end of it. I'd go to a primary. And my suspicion is because of what happened in Iowa. And, we did a much better job than Iowa. We had a more complicated process than Iowa because we had early voting and we did a decent job at it. But I think the caucuses have run their day. I mean, they were important for party building, as has been noted. They're important for the old idea of a New England town hall meeting, of direct citizen participation, of trying to influence a fellow citizen to your viewpoint, their discussions. All that's true. But they're also not accessible the way a primary is. And even if you look at the demographics, you had 52% of high school bachelor's degree holders in a state with something like 27% bachelor's degree holders. So it overrepresented educated folks. It overrepresented people who had the discretion to spend time in a caucus or had access to an early vote in a caucus. And a primary would help tremendously in terms of, we had over 100,000, we had 104,000 plus people. It was 84,000 in the last cycle. that's an improvement. But a primary, we might get 150 or 175,000 people out for.
Megan, do you agree? You think we'll get bigger turnout if we went to primaries?
I do, and I think you may get different results. I mean, to Governor List's point, I do think that Nevada is a solidly purple state with an independent streak. In 2018, the primary result was a moderate male Democrat versus a progressive white woman, and he won overwhelmingly. So I don't, and how that matches up with a Bernie Sanders by 20 plus percentage points, it's hard to square that circle for sure.
Governor List, we didn't get it through in 2015. We tried in our state legislation at that time. What makes the difference now? We're looking ahead at our 81st legislative session in about a year's time.
You're speaking of the primary?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. I think we're going to see it happen this time. I think that Republicans want to participate in the choice of candidates ordinarily for president when there are contrasts and contests. And I think that Nevada really on the national stage needs to have a clean-cut result that is known right away and needs more participants. We are a melting pot here. People of all stripes come to Nevada and love this state, and they stay.
Yep.
And it's more and more the case that we're seeing Nevada being looked at on I notice that all the newscasters nationally now know how to pronounce the state correctly. We're not hearing
there are a couple that don't, I've noticed, but you're right. The ratio is a lot bigger.
So I think if we're going to keep our position as an early voting state, we need to be primary. They like crisp results, and I think the Republicans want it as well as the Democrats.
Ed, I want to come back to you and talk about what you're seeing when you're out reporting now. The state might be up for grabs. We're talking about potentially a huge population that could swing one way or the other. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that? Are the people saying that Nevada is up for grabs right now?
So my point of reference, and the governor mentioned attending the Trump rally. I was down on the ground with those people as well that day, and I talked with a lot of different folks. And your point about the chance of voters swinging from Democrat to Republican, I did see some indication of that. I talked to one gentleman who traveled all the way from New Mexico just to attend the Trump rally, and he said that when in 2016, the first 2 years, he couldn't stand the guy, but now he's wearing a MAGA hat and he's got a Captain America shirt on, and it's all because he saw a documentary that changed his mind on things. So there are a lot of different influences going on right now. I mean, when was the last time you saw a presidential candidate have an entire merchandise line of pins and buttons and flags and red shirts? It's a formidable campaign. And I would say that, Nevada generally is going to be what they call the battleground. So,
Robert, let's talk a little bit about Democratic campaign strategies and moving forward here. Of course, Sanders is in the lead. It doesn't mean that that's how this is going to play out. How does this just play in with this large voter base here in Nevada? First off, are we going to see any type of campaigning now until primaries here at all?
No, I don't. I mean, they've moved on. They're in the other states. And, the strategy going forward is interesting. So compared with the way the Republicans elect or nominate, rather, a president, they have a winner-take-most or a winner-take-all strategy where they like to get an early winner who then goes out into the general campaign. And so if somebody starts gaining momentum like Trump did, I mean, Trump built a movement on a plurality originally before a majority, but he was getting so many delegates under the Republican rules. The Democrats are more winner-take-share. So if you look at the last two races, that had competition in 08 and 16, they went to June. Bernie almost had enough for a floor fight. Hillary Clinton was even closer to Barack Obama because we, in the Democratic side, the partition of votes is so different that it requires you to sort of grind it out. So, of course, the national punditry is all, Bernie has it in the bag. He might, but one of the other high probabilities that's still out there is an open convention, because it's possible that he might not, especially as crowded as the field is, gain a plurality. And if this were a primary, let's go back to point A. The first alignment is the closest we have to a primary. He won 34%. 2/3 of people voted against him. So if there was a primary, you wouldn't have had the narrative come out of the state where it appeared as if he had gained half, we wouldn't talk about this enormous spread. He still won substantially because there was a lot of divide in who was on the moderate side. But he's going to go into states that have primaries. And the outcome may reflect, a coalescence. If somebody emerges as a clear alternative, as happens somewhere mid-campaign, then it's a possibility that there'll be a contested election.
Megan, we've got about a minute left, and I want to come back to just some of our local races here, and maybe some of the down ballot issues we might see. We've got a favorite potentially in Sanders, getting closer to our own primary. We think this is going to affect some of our state campaigns and some of our state races that we're having here.
Absolutely, the top of the ticket always affects the down ballot races. And in this case, we don't have a governor's race this time. We don't have a U.S. Senate race. It's really presidential, and then everything else, the congressional races in CD3, where in 2016, Jackie Rosen won the House as the first time U.S. House member, but Trump also won that district. So she was able, in that case, to create a narrative of not being Hillary Clinton, but also not being Donald Trump, and was able to figure out a way to localize that race, but it's challenging. And so I do think that those local races will have their work cut out for them if Bernie Sanders is the nominee.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the discussion. And thank you, as always. Now, if you'd like to learn more about anything that we've discussed on the show, please visit our website at vegaspbs.org/Nevada-week. You can also always find us on social media at Nevada Week. Again, thank you so much.